Before the trenches, before the mustard gas, and before the broken maps of Europe began to bleed red, there was a world simmering with tension. A world where kings and emperors shook hands in public and sharpened their knives behind the closed doors. It was the age of steamships, telegrams, and towering egos, and it was about to explode. The early 1900s in Europe felt like something out of a chessboard soaked in gunpowder. Nations were armed to the teeth. Alliances were knotted tighter than ever, and the pride of empires filled the air like static before a storm. When that spark finally came, a single gunshot in a far off corner of Balkans, it didn't just echo, it ignited the world. And America? It watched, waited, debated, until it couldn't anymore. Welcome back to US History Understanding This Country. I am glad to have you with me again as we explore the next dramatic chapter in American history, the Great War, known to many today as World War I. Now, if you have been enjoying this podcast and feel it's been helping you see history in a new light, do consider supporting the show. Whether it is sharing an episode, leaving a review, or rating the podcast a 5-star in your favorite platform, every little bit helps us keep going. Thank you for being part of this journey. Now, let's head to the powder keg of Europe, where diplomacy failed and modern war was born. At the dawn of 20th century, Europe looked impressive. Crowned heads, powerful armies, grand colonies, and elegant cities. But beneath the surface, the continent was a loaded cannon set to fire. The peace was brittle, the ambitions were boiling, and history was about to prove that modernity didn't always mean wisdom. Historians often sum up the cause of the First World War with 4 bold letters: MAIN, main. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Let's break that down. Militarism was more than just building armies. It was a mindset. European nations poured resources into weapons, ships, and soldiers, not just for defense, but as a show of power. War wasn't seen as a failure of diplomacy, it was considered a tool of policy. Young men drilled in parades while generals plotted war plans years in advance. Then came the alliance. Promises made between countries to protect one another. Some of these were public, many were secret. 2 main blocs emerged: the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and the Great Britain, then Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Those days, Austria and Hungary were together. These weren't just clubs, they were like dominoes set in place so that if one country fell into conflict, the rest would follow, which is exactly what happened. Imperialism added fuel to the fire. These powers weren't just competing in Europe, they were clashing across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, scrambling for land, resources, and control. Resentment grew, jealousies festered, and then there was nationalism, fierce loyalty to one's own country or ethnic group. For some, it meant pride. For others, it meant wanting independence. In regions like Balkans, nationalism was a powder keg, where ethnic groups under imperial rule dreamt of breaking free. And then came the spark. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo, Bosnia. A young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped from a crowd and shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. His wife, Sophie. She was also killed. 2 bullets, 2 deaths, and the fuse was lit. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and declared war. Russia rushed to protect Serbia. Germany joined Austria-Hungary. France backed Russia. And when Germany invaded neutral Belgium to reach France, Britain declared war. In a matter of weeks, all of the Europe was at war. It wasn't going to be a quick war either. The world had never seen anything like that coming. This wasn't about glory, it was about survival. And the battlefield, it was about to change forever. At first, each nation believed victory would be swift. Soldiers marched off with flowers in their rifles, bands playing, families cheering. It would all be over by Christmas, they said. They were wrong. What unfolded was a war the world had never seen before, not just because of how many fought, but how they fought. Europe was still using 19th century tactics, cavalry charges, mass infantry lines, but they were now armed with 20th century weapons, machine guns, long-range artillery, and high explosives. And that mismatch turned fields into graveyards. The Western Front, stretching from Belgium to northern France, quickly became a frozen, bloody stalemate. Trench warfare was born. Imagine two lines of trenches, often just a few hundred feet apart, muddy, rat infested, filled with stench of death. In between was no man's land, a terrifying space laced with barbed wire and open fire. Soldiers lived in these trenches for weeks, sometimes months, enduring cold, hunger, disease, and constant bombardment. The goal was to gain a few yards. Often, those yards were paid in thousands of lives. Then came mustard gas, drifting low and yellow across the battlefield, burning lungs, blinding eyes, scarring flesh. Gas masks became a standard gear. Tanks and airplanes were introduced, but they were still primitive and unreliable. The killing, however, was tragically efficient. This war wasn't just a battle of armies, it was a grind, a machine that chewed up a generation of young men. By the end of 1916, the death toll was staggering. Millions were dead, millions more wounded. Entire towns in France and Belgium were reduced to rubble, and yet there was no end in sight. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America watched, still neutral, still distant, but not untouched. And soon the distance would shrink because war was a way of pulling even reluctant giants into the grasp. As Europe erupted into chaos, President Woodrow Wilson chose a different path for United States: neutrality. In 1914, when the war first broke out, Wilson stood before Congress and declared that the United States will remain, quote, impartial in thoughts as well as in action, unquote. He urged Americans to resist taking sides, not just in policy but in emotion. In theory, the US would trade with everyone and fight with no one. But staying neutral in a war of this scale, easier said than done. The American people were divided. Many immigrants, especially those from Germany and Eastern Europe, had deep ties to the countries now at war. Irish Americans often sympathized with Germany simply because they resented British rule in Ireland. Others, especially those with British and French roots, leaned towards the Allies. All this while, American businesses were doing very well. Though the US claimed neutrality, its economic ties to Britain and France grew stronger by the day. American banks lent billions to the Allies. American factories shipped weapons, food, and supplies. The war, though tragic, was a booming business. The sad part is, even after 110 years, war still is a profitable business for many. And yet, most Americans didn't want to send their sons to fight in someone else's war. They watched the horror unfold from across the Atlantic: gas attacks, massive offensives, staggering death tolls, and they were grateful for the ocean that separated them from it all. Wilson too hoped to keep America out of the conflict. In fact, he made that promise a central part of his re-election campaign in 1916. He kept us out of war. That was the slogan, a simple phrase but a powerful one. It helped Wilson win a narrow second term. It gave Americans hope that they could remain an island of peace in a sea of war. But history doesn't always honor slogans. And across the ocean, new threats were beginning to rise. Ones that would test Wilson's resolve and push the nation towards a decision it had tried so hard to avoid. United States' stand on neutrality gets harder with every passing month. The first challenge came from beneath the waves. Germany had declared unrestricted submarine warfare. That means what Germany called undersea boats and rest of the world called U-boats, sleek, silent submarines. It would target any ship they believed was helping the Allies, including those from the neutral nations like United States. British waters were now a war zone. The German torpedoes didn't ask for passports. Then came Lusitania. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed a British passenger liner RMS Lusitania. The ship was off the coast of Ireland when it was hit. She sank in just 18 minutes. Nearly 1,200 people died. 128 of them were Americans. Germany claimed the ship was carrying weapons, and it was, but public outcry in the US was deafening. People were horrified. Politicians demanded answers. The press called it murder on the high seas. Even then, Wilson held firm. He issued sharp warnings to Germany, but America stayed out of the war until Germany pushed harder. In early 1917, desperate to win the war quickly, Germany resumed full unrestricted submarine warfare. Knowing it might provoke America, they were betting they could defeat Britain before the US could fully react. But then came the moment that changed everything: the Zimmermann telegram. British intelligence intercepted a secret message from Germany's Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico. It proposed a bold plan. If Mexico joined the war against the United States, Germany would help them reclaim Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. The British passed the message to Americans. When Wilson made it public, the reaction was explosive. Even those who had supported neutrality were stunned. This wasn't just a war in Europe anymore, this was personal. Then in March, German U boats sank several more American ships, and so the final straw had been snapped. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany. He called it a fight to make the world safe for democracy. 4 days later, the United States was officially at war. After nearly 3 years of watching, debating, and hoping to stay out, America had joined the Great War. And with its entry came fresh energy, new troops, and a turning point that would shape the war's outcome and the century to come. The United States entered the Great War with hope, urgency, and a steep learning curve. This was the country's first full-scale modern war, and it needed to build an army fast. First came the Selective Service Act of 1917, the draft. Within weeks, young men across the country were registering for military service. Not all were eager, but the call was clear. The nation needed them. By war's end, over 2.8 million American men were drafted, and another 2 million volunteered. But war isn't just fought with soldiers. It's fought with steel, bread, and belief. Factories were transformed overnight, car manufacturers began making trucks for the army, clothing mills started stitching uniforms. The government created new agencies like the War Industries Board to coordinate the booming war economy. It was production on a scale the US had never attempted before. And at home, everyday citizens were asked to do their part. Food became a patriotic duty. Under the leadership of Herbert Hoover, Americans were urged to meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. Home gardens called Victory Gardens sprang up across cities and towns. Farmers were praised as soldiers of the soil. But for all of this to work, the government needed more than food and weapons. It needed public support. So it launched a massive campaign of propaganda. Colorful posters lined walls, urging Americans to buy Liberty bonds and beat the Hun. Songs like Over There stirred patriotism. Films, speeches, and even school lessons were designed to build enthusiasm and sometimes to shame the hesitant. But not everyone supported the war. Pacifists, socialists, and immigrants, especially those with ties from Germany, were wary of what this war meant. Some questioned why the US was fighting. Others worried that civil liberties were being sacrificed for the sake of unity. The government responded with force. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Seditions Act of 1918 made it a crime to criticize the war effort, the government, or its military. Thousands were arrested, newspapers were shut down. Even Eugene V. Debs, a prominent labor leader and former presidential candidate, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for giving a speech against the draft. The message was clear: support the war or stay silent. It was a tense time, full of flags and fear, pride and pressure. America was mobilized, yes, but it was also watching itself, struggling to balance democracy at home while fighting to defend it abroad. Still, the tide was turning, and soon American boots would hit European soil. By the time American troops reached Europe in 1917, the war had already been raging for 3 brutal years. The fields of France and Belgium were scarred with craters. The men in the trenches, French, British, Belgian, were exhausted, wounded, and weary. The fighting spirit still burned, but the fuel was running low. And then, across the Atlantic came the roar of ships. America had arrived. A newly formed American Expeditionary Force, AEF, led by General John J. Pershing, brought with it something Europe desperately needed: fresh strength. Pershing had insisted on one crucial point: the AEF would fight as a separate, independent force. He wanted the world to know that America wasn't just sending reinforcements, it was taking its own flag in the fight for victory. These American troops, many of them farm boys and factory workers, were well fed, well equipped, and eager to prove themselves. Their uniforms were crisp, their weapons new, their morale high. In contrast to the tired trenches of the old world, they presented energy, confidence, and the promise of a turning point. And turn it did. The AEF first saw major action in 1918, helping to halt German advance in Cantigny, then pushing through in battles like Bellewood and the Second Battle of Marne. The Doughboys, as they were called, earned respect and fear for their fierce fighting. One Marine commander at Bellewood famously told his men, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." As the Americans joined the fight, Allied morale surged. German troops meanwhile began to falter, not just from the battlefield, but from hunger, disease, and a sense that the tide was turning against them. By the fall of 1918, momentum had shifted. The Allies, now stronger with American muscle, pushed the Germans back. One town, one trench, 1 mile at a time. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't bloodless. Over 100,000 Americans died in the Great War. But their arrival had made a difference. The balance had shifted, and for the first time in years, peace didn't seem impossible. As the fall of 1918 approached, the sound of cannons faded. The German army, battered and pushed back, could no longer hold the line. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. The Great War was over. But peace was just beginning, and it would prove to be its own battlefield. President Woodrow Wilson, riding high on America's decisive role in Allied victory, came to Europe with a bold and idealistic plan: the 14 points. Wilson's vision wasn't about punishment, it was about preventing future wars. He wanted open diplomacy and no secret treaties, and freedom of seas, reduction of arms, fair adjustments of colonial claims, self determination of all nations. And at the heart of it all, his proudest idea, the creation of League of Nations, a global body meant to resolve disputes before it became wars. Europe had never seen an American president speak so confidently on world stage. Wilson was treated like a celebrity when he arrived in Paris for the peace talks. Crowds cheered, leaders listened. But not for long. For countries like France and Britain, the cost of war had been too great. Entire towns had been destroyed. Generations of young men were gone, and they wanted justice, or at least revenge. So, when the Treaty of Versailles was drafted in 1919, Wilson's 14 points were largely ignored. Instead, the treaty focused on punishing Germany. Germany had to accept full responsibility of the war, pay massive reparations to allies, give up territory including Alsace-Lorraine, and limit the size of its military. It was a harsh treaty. Germany didn't have any say in it, and while it ended the war, it also planted the seeds for the next one. Germans felt humiliated, betrayed, and cornered. Their economy would soon spiral, their politics would soon fracture, and out of that soil would grow another even darker chapter of history. As for Wilson's dream, the League of Nations, it was written into the treaty, but irony struck hard. The United States never joined. The war was done, but the world wasn't healed. Far from it. The soldiers came home. The factories that had once churned out rifles and rations turned back to making radios, refrigerators, and cars. Families reunited, cities threw parades. The American flag fluttered high, proud, and battle tested. But when the cheering faded, a deeper question lingered in the air. What now? The Great War was over, but the peace that followed was uneasy. America, once reluctant to join the conflict, now faced a new role on the global stage, a superpower in the making. Yet, back home, the mood was shifting. People were tired of war, of sacrifice, of foreign entanglements. They didn't want idealism. They wanted rest. As one US Senator famously said, quote, "America's present need is not heroics, but healing," unquote. And so, in the election of 1920, the American people made their feelings clear. They elected Warren G. Harding, a man whose campaign promised one simple thing: a return to normalcy. It was a clear message. America wanted to step back from the world, to focus on home, to enjoy the prosperity of peace and let Europe handle its own mess. And that dream Wilson had fought so hard for, the League of Nations, it died quietly in the Senate. Despite his global fame and tireless campaigning, Wilson could not convince Congress to join. Many feared the League would pull US into more foreign affairs. Some saw it as a threat to national sovereignty. Without America, the League was born weak, and though it would meet, debate, and sign papers, it lacked the strength to stop what was coming just a few years down the road. Meanwhile, the world that emerged from the war was not the same one that entered it. Empires had collapsed, the Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Russians. New countries appeared on the map, colonial resistance movements gained inspiration. A global economy took its first breath and would soon stumble into a Great Depression. And in Germany, bitterness simmered. The Great War was supposed to be a war to end all wars. But history, as we know too well, doesn't work that way. Still, for a brief moment, in the early 1920s, America exhaled. The battle was behind it, the future unknown. And so, we leave the trenches behind for now and step into the new age of jazz, consumer culture, and shifting identities. The Roaring Twenties are up next. But before we dance into the dazzling decade, let's wrap up today's journey through the war that changed everything. The Great War. A war that redrew the world, tested democracy, and thrust the United States onto the global stage in a way it had never experienced before. It was called the Great War because it was the largest conflict humanity could not fathom in scale. No one could have imagined that another world war was brewing in the background of Europe. It wasn't until after the Second World War the Great War began to be referred to as World War I. We have seen how ancient rivalries, tangled alliances, and unchecked pride exploded into the first truly modern war. How new technologies made killing easier and peace more difficult. We followed America's struggle between isolation and engagement, between idealism and reality, and we witnessed the cost. Not just in lives, but in trust, unity, and the hope that the war might ever be behind us for good. But as the dust of the war settled and America pulled back from the world stage, something else was brewing, not in the halls of Versailles or the trenches of France, but in the streets of Chicago, the clubs of Harlem, and the radio waves dancing through the air. The Roaring Twenties were coming. It would be a decade of jazz, flappers, skyscrapers, and speakeasies. A time of bold dreams, booming markets, and deep divisions. The world had been shaken, and now it was ready to reinvent itself. And that's exactly where we are headed next. Thank you for listening to US History Understanding This Country. If you have been enjoying this journey, please take a moment to share this episode or leave a review. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and as always, stay tuned. Bye.